Hi, everybody. It's Josh, broadcasting from the home office, but this time the home is where I grew up. I had the chance to come back to Albany, New York to visit my parents. So, first time in a year and a half, and it's a very meaningful reunion. So, it's all the more special that I'm able still to provide these messages of Torah. It's a big kavod for me, it's a big honor. And that's what we're going to be talking today about is the honor, the dignity of the human being as testified through the practice of the priest. Just a content note for this Devar Torah, the verse we'll be focusing on is responses to mourning, which involve potential self-harm. So if that's something you're sensitive to, something to be aware of, and to decide to progress or not. It's called the Bald Truth, Parshat Emor. The first part of Parshat Emor details the manifold laws and regulations surrounding the Kohanim, the priests who served as religious functionaries in the tabernacle and temple. The book of Leviticus is largely focused on the vocation of the Kohanim, which one can infer from its Latin name, Leviticus, like from Levi, and the rabbinic name for the book, Torat Kohanim, makes that even clearer. Sefer Vayikra began by describing the substance of what the sacrificial system entailed and what the offerings were comprised of and how to offer them, what animals were allowed or not, and then it moved on to discuss the extracurricular roles of the priest as proto-dermatologists and epidemiologists in diagnosing sarat, which is often called leprosy, but which isn't really leprosy. But the book had yet to actually treat the priests themselves in their private, personal lives. When the limelight of the menorah dims, when the Kohen retires to his quarters, what does being a priest entail? Kahuna, big or small, sits at the juncture of prestige and restriction. Contemporarily speaking, beside the relatively humble honor of receiving the first aliyah, or dibs on leading benching, being a Kohen largely is about what one cannot do. One cannot attend funerals outside of one's closest family. One cannot marry a subset of persons. However, in this Devar Torah, I'd like to focus on a relatively minor and less famous restriction on the behavior of priests. One that is especially baffling because it seems to be repetitive, though, as I hope we all know by now, nothing in the Torah is ever unnecessarily present. In Leviticus 21, verses 5 to 6, it reads, "They shall not balden their heads or shave the corner of their beards. They shall not cut their flesh. They shall be holy for their God, because they offer sustenance to their God by fire, and so must be holy." As Rashi notes, this interdiction seems extraneous, since these restrictions apply to every Jew. These verses follow laws regarding mourning, and the Torah forbids every single individual from mortifying or harming, chas v'shalom, themselves as a way to respond to loss. So why is it that these restrictions are reiterated in these laws about priests? Rashi, in his commentary, summarizes the Gemara, Makot 20a through 21a, in running down every possible way in which these regulations could offer something different than the universal version found later in the Torah, in Deuteronomy Parshat Re'eh. In the later version, directed towards every Jew, the Torah specifies that one is not supposed to shave between one's eyes, so one may have thought that a non-Kohen Jew is allowed to shave the rest of their head in mourning. But this is not so, because the expected trajectory of the verse, in which the general principle, the law for every Jew, informs the particular, just the Kohanim, it's reversed. It's the special case of the Kohen that expands the law for all Jews. Because the word korcha, the pate of one's head, is used in both verses, we learn from this that no one is allowed to engage in any act of self-mortification through shaving one's head. Similarly, Leviticus 19:27 commands all Jews not to destroy the corners of one's face, i.e. the beard, but the use of razor in our verse, in the Kohen verse, limits this restriction to using a straight-edged blade. This is why shaving with an electric razor on one's face is allowed, since the blades do not actually come into contact with one's skin. Now this leaves us in a strange position, at least for the purposes of this Devar Torah. We began with a look at this verse to better understand the nature of kahuna, of what being a priest entails. But instead, we see how, in Jewish law, these laws for priests that seem to be directed solely for the priests actually come to either expand or to delimit laws relevant for every Jew. We are still left with the question, though, What is it that these laws teach us about what it means to be a priest? And what does it mean for the rest of us? To be a Kohen is to be restricted, sanctioned, set aside. Rashi's understanding of holiness, found near the end of last week's Parsha, Kedoshim, is that to be sanctified means to be separate, to be special. When one dedicates property to the temple, rendering it hekdesh, one sets it aside as something devoted to the holy space of the temple and its services. By taking on the loss of one of the elements of economic production in an agrarian society, or the bounty that has been produced, one shows one's devotion and dedication to God by making a sacrifice, by generously donating this to the temple. And the system and society which God commands is supported by your devotion. The Kohanim, in this way, are an entire genealogy set aside, devoted and dedicated to God's service. And thus, they experience the line between sacred and profane, between holy and the everyday, as the contours that structure their very lives. They are commanded to remain holy, separate and restrained, an outsourced holiness to serve the rest of the people. They do it so we don't have to. In a way, though, we forswear human sacrifice. In their living service, they too are an offering. So while no Jew is allowed to become impure without due cause, according to Halacha, the permission the Torah makes for Kohanim to attend the funerals of loved ones, thus is all the more powerful. But in that way, that humane allowance is also all the more dangerous. A population living its life in the rarefied halls of the temple may not have the emotional tools to tolerate such proximity to death and loss. Or perhaps, just as they were to be paragons of holiness and purity, outsourced from the rest of the people, when they delve into the recesses of loss, one might think that they also serve in that emblematic role. Perhaps they should mark themselves with their pain, inscribe themselves with their loss, show us the bald truth of what death entails. But no. Such a punishing and poisoned religion is not one God would ever ask of us, and not the way a family dedicated to God's service would ever be asked to perform. The Sforno makes note of this in his comment on the verse. He writes, "Even though all this is for the sake of honoring their dead, they do not have permission to denigrate their dignity. For the purpose of the prestige of the Kohanim is to honor God, and when they denigrate themselves, they also denigrate my name." One could understand how one might get sucked into the gravity well of grief. Loss is a powerful thing. However, the Kohanim are commanded not to allow death to overcome them, not to allow despair to defeat them. They must never forget that they bear the banner of the glory of God. It's not an accident that the same word to refer to the priest's prestige and to refer to God's glory, kavod, is the same word used to refer to one's duty to the dead, to honor them. The acts prohibited by the Torah take the grief one feels and turns it back on oneself. But Sforno's comment refocuses the trajectory of the priest's emotional response back into life. To honor the dead by honoring the name of God, we never, ever denigrate the inherent dignity with which we have been imbued by the divine. We honor our dead when we recommit ourselves to the holiness of and in life. After such a challenging and painful year, one that has carried so much loss and grief, we are left perhaps as mystified and as challenged as the Kohen, once ensconced in holiness but now lost in mourning's mist. Just as every Jew's instructions for how to respond to grief are learned from the priest, about not shaving the head, about how you can cut your beard, so we can learn this from them as well. It's not just the Kohanim who are called a holy people. The entire people of Israel are called a mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests. Our lives, too, are an offering made to God. We, too, are commanded to choose life. Uvacharta b'chaim. to honor our dead through generosity and acts of service, to never forget the dignity of bearing the name of God, and to honor those we've loved the most by making a holier world in their memory. So may it be. Shabbat Shalom.